I do a lot of work in the company to help think about the way in which we interact with customers and the way customers themselves are working, what they need, what their greatest pain points are, so that we can focus our work on what's best in service of those needs. And so I'm going to share with you some of our work in that regard today. One of the things that's clear, right, is that the K12 audience that's out there, all of you doing work to steward facilities, are facing and have been facing for some time some tremendous challenges, right? Challenges that certainly are the post-pandemic challenges, all right? The cost issues, right? The market pressures, the supply chain issues, the inflationary issues, even the interesting dynamic of getting money and listening to it have to go away next September, right? A lot of the pandemic issues have been tremendous. And we're going to talk a little bit about that world and how it's changed, how your environment's changed over the last several years. Those represent opportunities for certainly strategic sort of thinking and insights that have been very difficult to put on the table recently, and we want to offer our thoughts on what some understanding we've developed in some research might lead you to think about, and it certainly got us thinking about some things. All right, so we maybe also want to say that we recognize that we can't really understand the future. We can do our best to understand the present, right? And that gives us our best shot at understanding the future. And so that's where we're gonna start our work. So we did recognize that we needed to make those changes in those understandings. So we collaborated with Forrester Research. We collaborated with Forrester Research because we wanted to get an understanding of what's happening using some mechanisms and some instruments that are much more rigorous than we might use, frankly. We want to partner our technical knowledge with their capacity for doing research. And so we engaged in a study this summer. And they connected with 204 people from across the country. I'll show you some of the demographics in a second. In a double-blind structure so that the researchers didn't know who they were getting data from, and the folks providing the information didn't know who the researchers were, in an effort to make sure we were really clear on getting answers that were unimpeded by our presence or our direction. We did shape the questions. So some of the questions are exciting to us, and they may be, we hope they're exciting to you and interesting to you in terms of what's happened. But we want to make sure that you understand there's a tremendous amount of integrity, we hope, in the data, so it's worth thinking about in terms of its implications for you and the people you work with. Demographically, a broad range of states and situations, geopolitically and socially and economically. Unless, of course, you're in like Michigan, you're not seeing yourself on the list, but a tremendous amount of population in the country, a variety of urban and rural situations, coast to coast, a lot of different positions, a lot of different roles, a lot of different people, kinds of people, but a pretty good representation of the kinds of people who are stewards for institutions. It's about 50% under 10,000 students, right, and about 50% above that. A good mix of different types of institutions and needs and resources and skill sets. And finally, 60% public and 40% in that private and charter realm, which is a decent representation of what's been happening, moving away from publics or the introduction of more private and charter options to places. We want to see if we can pay attention to that too. So hopefully feels like a reasonable representation of folks. And I wanted to share a couple just key findings at the top here, right? We're going to get into a bunch of detail. I'm going to bitter end. I'm holding on to that thought. We're going to get you through a lot of little detail, but a couple high-level things here, right? There's clearly a challenge to find strategic priorities right now. You're going to see a lot of equity in terms of the scoring, right? A lot of people with shared, like complicated issues, equally biased in terms of the importance. Those challenges of particular interest, frankly, are this issue of difficulty with internal staff, difficulty with either getting the right number of staff or having the right expertise for the challenges you're facing today. This issue of having the right data to make decisions, excuse me, important to us. And then certainly the notion of finding the right partners, right? All of those things are pretty high-level issues that we're interested in, and we're going to talk about how we got to that at some point. And finally, related to that partnership issue, this interesting notion that a lot of schools are indicating, a lot of people are indicating that they're wanting to consolidate and work with a smaller number of people and partners to really put value in those partnerships. So interesting And interesting for us, we're hoping interesting to you. So let's get into some of that data. So here you go, a whole bunch of data. I'm not going to ask you to read it all. I'm going to try to talk to some of this. You're going to see these things, these kind of images repeatedly. But this is the first glimpse at that idea that when surveyed, there's not a lot of differentiation, right? Everybody's got a lot of problems, and they're all pretty important to everybody, right? I suspect that feels familiar to you. I'm guessing that feels like a pretty normal thing. But maybe in your certain circumstance, you have got some greater priority than the other. I think a couple of those things that are interesting on that slide. At the very top, this notion of consistency, right? The idea that people want a reliable service. They want a reliable product, and you're expected as facilities providers to make that happen. That doesn't surprise us necessarily. The ESG issues, right, are becoming more and more pressing across the country. And so that's a high driver for kind of management challenges and questions, as well as health and safety. You know, you guys have talked throughout this session about some complicated health and safety challenges, right? That's ever present in our mind as parents, as citizens in the communities, but certainly as all of you as operators and stewards of the properties. If we jump down to the lower section for a little section on those improvement drivers, competitive differentiation is interesting for us, right? With movement around the country, there is a fascinating challenge to try to distinguish as new people are moving in and out of your district, how you can provide the best service, and certainly with your arrival of privates and charters, right? Even more pressure on trying to understand how you make sure that people are excited about the place that you're working. It's kind of the feedback we're getting. Below that, right, this notion of dealing with all of the movement itself, right, the changing population. It doesn't really matter whether you're in Maine and people are leaving or you're here in Texas and people are arriving, right? The transition and the change in your campus is a complexity that you have to manage. And it requires a significant amount of attention. There are also a couple of familiar other issues on there that have been there forever. The sort of deferred maintenance, right? Everybody's talking about how to deal with deferred maintenance, how to manage it, right? You can't phase it out, really. It's a question of how you manage it, how you fold it into all your other strategy and how you're thinking, right? That's one. And then two, funding and financing. It's notoriously true, right? That are very thin resources for K12 across the country. It doesn't matter whether you're public or even in that private and other. Finding the right cash to make the right decisions is hard, and so it's a significant driver in the decision-making process that you face. Those were mostly internal issues. What about some of the external pressures, right? Again, consistency. Everybody's 60 to 70% here, kind of, these are high priority, or high impact, or very high impact, significantly. The pandemic is the thing that's ringing in our ears, so it's certainly going to be the one that we're all talking about still, even though we'd like to say it's gone, we know it isn't. But the others are fascinating, right? The climate change issue, the recession that is supposed to arrive that still hasn't arrived yet, but it's on people's minds, right? And then, interestingly, both internal and external political dynamics are playing, right? Each of you in a different state has a different kind of political kind of set of characteristics and set of rules and pressures, and so that certainly is part of the drama for you. And then the global political scheme or activities, right, are creating tension such that we're worried about it affecting oil prices, we're affecting energy prices, we're worried about it affecting the federal resources that might be available to us. So the number of implications of geopolitical issues outside the country are just as important, ironically, for a lot of people as some of the things that are happening internally and locally. A complicated array of things. And one more example of the lack of ability to sort of struggle to prioritize the biggest pressures, the biggest issues. Procurement, right? It's a topic that's interesting to us, and so here's an issue that's about part of the data. Procurement behaviors are fascinating. We're seeing a lot of different techniques and tools being used, and not a lot of differentiation, frankly, between traditional mechanisms, right? The kind of IFBs, the RFPs are kind of trying to go through traditional process where you get a lot of control, takes a lot of process, takes a lot of time, you can move things forward. And yet there are also a lot of use and activity in some of those other kinds of mechanisms, right? Co-ops, state contracts, borrowing off of other state agency resources to kind of buy things, right? This notion of how to buy construction, how to buy planning and facilities activity is pretty widely distributed. We're intrigued by it, we're fascinated by it, right? And we're wanting to learn more about it from all of you. And actually, as we go on toward the end of the session, I'm looking for feedback from all of you about whether these things resonate with you. I'm interested in actually your crosstalk, but I'm also interested in Observer and what it is you're experiencing. But very fascinated by this kind of dynamic of lots of instruments being tried to be used to have an impact on moving things forward, right? And our speculation is Our speculation is you want to move quickly. You want to get things done quickly. And some of those more traditional instruments are harder to move, and it's easier if you can get straight to the procurement process to buy those services. So a lot of good data there. And I see some of you scribbling. I hope you're scribbling because all of the great things I'm saying are fantastic, but we will definitely make sure all of these resources are available to you so you can have them at the end. If you've got that dynamic, if you've got that set of circumstances, we're also hearing in the feedback from the research that there's a struggle. There's a struggle to kind of get things done, to get your goals accomplished. The top 4, interesting in particular, to me, at least for you guys today. The top one feels like something that it's got to be familiar now, but in the past, right? Anytime the demographic changes on your campuses, it's moving way faster than you can build. It's way faster than you can demolish, right? The change in your facilities portfolio is going to be a dynamic process you're always dealing with as the district grows or shrinks. It's hyper-accelerated for some people in the country right now as we're watching the decline in parts of the country and the expansion in others, right? So that's a big, big deal that goes on. The ES&G goals, right? Struggling to keep up with those as the rules change, as the aspirations change, as the conversations change with you. How you build and sustain a community, a built community to support all those things continues to be a really significant challenge for everybody. That third one is familiar to anybody of a certain age, that everything seems like it's going faster, so it may have nothing to do with the reality, but certainly the changes that are happening digitally in terms of data and how the information moves, and really also socially, right? We're seeing a lot of social change right now, and you're trying to provide a space for the educational experience for students and trying to do that in the right way to support the conversations that are happening in the community, and that's a challenge for everybody to make happen in the physical way. And again, that competitive differentiation showing up again. One more, not able to keep up with trying to set up the unique characteristics that really are what are about your school organization, right? What are the things that are special about your place? That's a big, big challenge that we're seeing in the data. If you're not meeting your goals, you're going to fall short some places. That's just what happens. Here are some of those kinds of issues on the screen. I want to break them out maybe into 2 different groups. There's a financial piece, right? If you look at the 3rd, 4th, and 7th, we're talking about penalties, right? We're talking about the funding challenges, right? You're not getting the money you need, or you're not able to make the argument to get the money you need, right? And then finally, the ongoing issue of just of increasing operational costs, right? Which is everything from inflationary costs to just the pressures from supply chain challenges that have forced prices through the roof. Operationally, the safety and health conditions is the #1 issue, right? That's the #1 way in which you're all feeling vulnerable. That's not surprising to any of us, whether we have children in places or we're watching the news, trying to make sure that you're able to provide safe places with all of the conditions the way they need to be, but also, unfortunately, trying to address the security issues that are front and center in so many conversations today. But the lack of understanding in data, fascinating to us. Fascinating that you don't have the data. You don't have the data that you need, or at least the survey participants didn't. I shouldn't assume. Maybe you're all perfect and everything's great for where you are, right? But lacking in the data and information to make the right decisions, right? A struggle. Buried in the data, only like 1% to 4% of respondents indicated that they have monies allocated for those kinds of assessments and real investments in the kinds of issues that come from understanding your property. So a fascinating shortcoming in terms of the resources available to get that data. And then deferred maintenance projects, again, very, very familiar kinds of topics. So let's talk a little bit about sort of strategy and sort of resources here a little bit. We asked a couple questions about what would happen if you got more money or you lost money, right? And to all those questions, what's fascinating in the top half, if we increase the amount of dollars in increments of 5, 10, 20, and more, right? 55% said they'd need to see a 20% increase in the budget before they felt like there'd be any positive impact in their ability to get resources and to move things forward. Fully 55% felt that you needed that big a jump to be able to affect the kind of resources you need to invest forward. Conversely, it it would only be about a 10 to 20%, only about 10% or more a reduction, right? Meant that 80% of people said that they would start to see a decline in their services with just a 10% drop. So a lot more money it takes to move things forward, and a lot less money it takes to pull yourself behind, right? Probably a classic human nature thing, right? We're conservative about moving things forward, and we're eager to protect the downside if we start to see money going away. But that exemplifies the challenge that you're facing because budgets are constrained in so many parts of the country. It's not just about the money, it's about the people and the information you have, right? People and the information. We asked some questions around the human capital, right? The human capacity for investment. And some familiar things that I shared at the very outset start to show up here, right? A sense in the first and fifth one there on the list that there's a problem with the partnerships that you have in terms of the capacity to get the right partners to have the right decisions and the right information. And again, the repeat of this issue, 50% of people indicating that they are struggling with having the right number of people or the right capacities and skill sets to actually have an impact, right, on the things that they need to do. The second one is a return of that data conversation, right? What's happening with data. Without data and without quality people or people that you feel confident in, it's no surprise that you see a lot of the other things on this list start to show up, right? An inability to secure funding for large major projects, an inability to be able to identify ways to get us to secure a real ROI on something, which is hard in some cases anyway when we're talking about education to secure an ROI, but you have even less chance if you don't have the resources and the team and the information around you to do it. And then some of the other things in there in terms of coping with regulatory requirements, all of those things, you want to have the right people around you and the right team and the right information. So really fascinating kind of truisms, at least for us, starting to resonate. I see some smiles and some just kind of, he's crazy. So I'm looking forward to responses to that later. All right, so jumping on the bandwagon of that first issue, this issue of partnership and colleagues, I did say that we post the questions, and so some of these things are of interest to us, and so this is one of them, right? This is the worst eye chart in the deck, I promise. But fascinating. Again, one of those truisms about all this data. Not a lot of differentiation, right? Not a lot of differentiation about what's important and what's not important. But in this particular case, we take that as a desire to have high quality relationships across the board, right? A lot of reasonable, high expectations for the partnerships that you have, the people that you work with. We expect that's because you have the same kinds of expectations for the people internal to your firm, your schools, right? But we want to make sure that we honor that too, and we encourage other partners to honor that across the board. In particularly tied to facilities issues, right? This notion of having people who understand life cycles, people who understand, right, strategic planning and visioning, right? People who have a history, right, have done this before, or at least have the capacity to handle change. I have Ryan Holiday playing in my head when I look at this slide, right? This idea of the capacity to be able to respond to change and be able to kind of be a partner, not just for the moment, for the RFP, but for the long haul, right? That's an important kinds of issues. You want somebody you can work with, not someone you have to keep directing all the time. And then several other really interesting things in there about communication skills, right? Really important to be a communicator, right? Helping to communicate with the people they're working with. They want partners that. We also sense that they want people to be able to help them with the communication process with the community, right? To tell the stories, to communicate the ROA conversations, right? To demonstrate the advocacy that's necessary in all of the circumstances that are in play. Really, really interesting thing. And then finally, one that was exciting to a couple of us we were talking about was that the ability to tailor, right? The ability to adjust, right? Don't want sort of the stock kind of answer. Don't want this sort of everyday thing. They want the capacity and reality to react to your particular circumstances, your particular realities, right? Pretty important to pay attention to what's important to you, not what's important to the partner you're working with. We specifically got into issues around the total quantity of partners, right, that people are working with. I don't know, this number surprised me. 11 to 15 different partners being worked with And this is just in the facilities realm. We made clear in the questions that this wasn't, counting elevator service contractors or a plumber you have on a retainer, right? This is literally just the people and the organizations that you're working with to handle the planning and the construction services, right? So that's a very interesting and significant number, 45% people saying it's in that range, distributed everywhere else. Not surprisingly, 62% said that they're working with a preferred provider, right? That very familiar to get comfortable with one or two or a few people and just settle in with them and work with them. You trust them, you believe in them, they're good within your community, they understand the kinds of things you need. So there's definitely this focus on preferred providers. But we saw in some of the earlier data that there was a desire to have more engagement, right? Stronger participation in those things. So there's a little bit of tension there. We're not quite sure what that tension means, right? We like to believe it means that there's room for just simply consolidating some of those other skills underneath the preferred providers, but we're not sure. I'd love your feedback on that. And when we asked about why this issue of what would happen with consolidation, these were some of the answers we got. And again, you're seeing numbers, 33%, 29%, right? These are numbers that indicate that there are a lot of different reasons why people want to see a focus, around the partnerships and the strengthening of those partnerships. So across the top, it's a little differentiation between the smaller schools and the bigger schools, right? Doesn't surprise us that the smaller districts and communities are more desiring of certain kinds of performances. They have less resources, they have less capacity necessarily to take on some things. And so this notion of communication is really a significant issue for the smaller schools in particular, but the desire to have more innovation, right? More creativity, right? A partner you can work with to really think outside the box to solve your problems. And then this issue of risk management, right? You don't want to be managing all of the variables that could lead to confusion and dysfunction and discontinuity. You want partners that work with you that can help you understand and think through those things to be able to manage risk, right? A big priority for everybody. The consequences of which we know tragically are too great. And then we wanted to know what was success. What does success look like? Right? What does success look like? And those were three of the top. Right? Positive feedback. Right? You want people to say, hey, that was a good thing. They built a good school. That's a great experience. That was an awesome renovation. Right? It got done in a timely fashion. Right? All of those kinds of positive feedbacks you want. That it was a project that understood what we want as a community. It was finally the kind of elementary experience we'd like our students to have, right? All of those kinds of positive feedbacks would make sense to us, right? Environmental sustainability jumped up as one. It was interesting to us, right? Very interesting that was a priority as one, but still only 30%, right? So distributed across other kinds of priorities. And then integration, right? The process of possibly integrating, right? To be working with the system. You don't want to work with somebody you have to convert to. You want them to kind of get to your world. That customization reference earlier in the deck too, right? So in conclusion, we want to sort of highlight these couple things, right? You're facing the challenge to make lots of decisions quickly. It's changing on you all the time. You don't always have the resources you need, right? Whether it's people, or cash, right? And so what you're looking for is strategic change that can give you those things. One of those options is partnerships. There are plenty of other things you can do. It's an interesting sort of self-reflection about what other choices you can make internally as an organization to do that. But what you're looking for in partners in particular, right, is the bandwidth to do all those things with you, to help you support those things, to expand those things, to accelerate those things where it was necessary. And you want genuineness. You want integrity, and you want the capacity to really do all the things in a way that's connected and tied together. All right, so I did 40 minutes in 20. That gives all of you 20 minutes or at least 5, right, to offer up some thoughts, some feedback to each other. Does this stuff resonate to you? I sprinted through it. I can go back to any piece that is questionable or challenging to you, but does this resonate? Does this make sense to you? Does this feel right? Did Forrester do a good job of mining the content of people's brains across the country?
Oh, this will be the same table.
I was really surprised to see on one of your earlier slides that ESG was ranked so highly. those of us in the sustainability field, that's our dream slide to see. And I'm curious to know sort of if there was a definition given, or just what your thoughts are on that. That was surprising to me.
Yeah, it's a fair question, right? We could give a description on what we think it means, but we don't know whether they mean supporting ESG practices and what you're doing to teach students about ESG issues, or whether it's living up to ESG expectations. Our intent was to sort of live up to ESG expectations being imposed upon the district itself in terms of those expectations. We think that certainly means sustainability issues and social issues in terms of the environmental and social. The governance gets a little bit harder. ESG is originally a corporate kind of language that got moved into education, and so I'm always fascinated by what governance actually means. I think that's a school district to school district kind of issue, but because the topic is talked about as much as it is, that's why we included it. We'd like to believe, right? We'd like to believe it means that these are issues that are important in terms of the character and the makeup of the buildings and the systems to support that in the district. And we think we do need to do a little more research, I think, to kind of confirm all that. Absolutely.
Being from Nebraska, I couldn't help notice a lack of, and which you addressed at the very beginning, lack of Midwest representation. So I was just curious kind of why that happened with it, or what you think we can expect from those audiences who weren't incorporated in this.
It's a great question, right? We turned to Forrester for their capacity to do a lot to get the best experience across that. I think it's an interesting observation. There's certainly much more dynamic activity and growth happening in those other places, and certainly that's an issue, but I think that's the kind of feedback I'm looking for, right? I think if there's enough interest, I think we can certainly think about ways we can explore that for those other parts of the country. I think a lot of the things that we saw in the survey, as I indicated, about things like movement and dynamics, they apply just as much in Maine or in Nebraska as they would here in Texas or out in California in terms of the dynamic of change. I think some of the local solutions are going to have to be different, right? The way in which you solve a problem in Nebraska and Maine, for example, is pretty different in terms of what's happening in those locations. Do you feel like the trending in the data was consistent with your experience in Nebraska?
I'd say some of them, but yeah, we all kind of turned to each other with that ESG question too of, wow, I'm really surprised that's so high. So I think yes on some of them, but we also all turned to each other with that response of how many partners. Some of the 11 to 15 was very surprising to me. So yes on some, and some were surprising to me.
Yeah, right, 11 to 15 makes sense to me if you've got a 50,000 plus school district, but to see 45% of respondents say that it was in that range is pretty remarkable. Particularly when there's somebody also saying they have a preferred provider. I'm like, who are the other 14 if you have a preferred provider, right? But it speaks to the complexity of the challenges that you're facing. It means that when I don't know, if you just design a building, right, you may have a preferred architect, but there are a range of partners that you might have to bring in depending on your particular procurement process or particular regulatory requirements. You may have to have a whole host of additional independent partners that then you're forced to manage, right? If you're doing planning and surveying and assessment kinds of activities, right? If you're doing the studies, doing a conditions assessment or something else, you may find yourself partnering. You might be able to do a conditions assessment, but not necessarily the environmental component if you want to talk about, watershed implications. So you find yourself juggling a whole host of partners, and I think it may be a reflection of technical complexity. There are a bunch of states in there on the borders of the country, right? In California and Europe, where the regulatory environment is extraordinary. And so that may be forcing some of that data to be that place. But it's a real issue. And as much as those are notorious regulatory environments, I happen to know that regulation isn't simple in Nebraska either. So those kinds of presences may be driving some of that density.
Anyone else? Yes, ma'am.
Just drawing from the data and knowing what I struggle with, excuse me, in my district as a leader for goals, certainly we sit in a reactionary state most of the time. And a lot of that is due to funding, but I don't know that I could throw any more money at our facilities group and have them work any harder or faster because we don't have the capacity to do all of the things that extra money would pay for. I wonder if in this or along the way, you've had conversations in terms of generational issues, right? So what I battle is folks that have been there for a very long time, and there's a layer of complacency, then folks that are newer, and there's a layer of just sort of lackadaisical behavior. So it's interesting, when we talk about boomers and Gen X and millennials, And I find that to be a struggle in my district, not just with facilities, but across some of my teams, that our way of being proactive can sometimes be way behind the curve, not intentionally, but that's because it's how it's always been done.
Yeah.
When now you could simply say, hey, there's an app for that. Like we could speed this up really and truly. So I wonder if you've had any conversations, if that's come up in anything in terms of hitting targets. Like, are we staying in like, the archaic way of doing things within facilities?
In my head, there are answers all over the place, right? There was the one slide referencing procurement processes, for example, and there is a kind of a bit of the way we've always done things versus moving forward to some other things. So we see some dynamic as people moving in different directions. My head is spinning a little bit because I actually had the privilege of sitting in a higher ed discussion at 8:30, and they were talking about the fact that people are just burned out, and it doesn't matter whether it's the more mature people or the younger folks. The last few years have just been really tremendous periods of burnout, and so there's exhaustion in trying to cope with all the things. It's exacerbated, I think, in any situation where you have the constrained financial resources that exist, right, for so many K-12 districts, right? The ability to your point, even if you had the money, you're not sure they could get more productivity out of them. So I think there are a number of issues along that way where we've got to find out ways to mine it. This is referencing partnership, right? And without betraying any secrets, I'm part of those firms that does that sort of partnership stuff, right? And I think one of the things we need to make sure we're doing in collaborating is making sure that it isn't a heavy lift to get that partnership and you get that value out of it. And sometimes if it's done right, it can be inspirational, right? It can be motivational to other people to get them to move forward. But it's obviously a big, big challenge that's in K-12 world. I can tell you it's the same over there in higher ed. That's what they were talking about, that issue of how do you motivate people, how do you train people, how do you grow them and get them excited and want to stick around. It's a big, big challenge, and if I can offer out in the business world, it's the same thing, right? The same kind of challenge and exhaustion. The question is, what do we do to be strategic? What do we do to take the information, the process to be strategic and to focus the money? If you can find ways to be successful, you can find ways to get those wins, you can get that validation, people start to get excited about it, right? You're not always reactive, you're starting to be proactive. We're big advocates of data, right? There's no hidden thing there. Big advocates of data, and we see it as a charge to try to find a way to help institutions get more data, better data to make decisions. Right? If you're going to be living with a limited portfolio of cash, you don't want to spend your money anywhere. You don't use those human resources anywhere except where you truly think you're going to get the best value out of it. And so the more you can plan ahead, what is it, Drucker? You can't manage what you don't measure, right? So you have to be able to have the information to make the right strategic moves to move forward to combat that issue of lethargy. Although we were told on Sunday night we weren't supposed to. This to Gen Z people, right? But the reality is there is that kind of malaise, right? There's that lack of motivation and interest, and we need to find ways to stimulate that. We think you can do that with data. We think you can do it with the right people, with the right collaborations to get to move forward. It's not easy. It's not simple. And you're right. Most institutions aren't sitting on a pile of cash, but there is a way we can try to find a way to motivate that and energize that.
We may have time for one last question for Pete.
A brooding voice, man.
Well, yes, ma'am. Boston Public School strikes again.
Sorry. Your comments about this last conversation made me have a question about any surveys that might be being done post-pandemic for facilities management staff, particularly those who are essential workers. I think there's a moment there that we don't want to lose to capture what was that experience. And even, I think you raised an important point that I'll speak for myself. Many of us have trauma from that experience that we went through as essential workers. But given our role, we're just expected not to stop, to just keep going. And we take pride in that in a way too. It's kind of sick. Yeah. So just be interesting as if you know of any surveys or if you're planning to do any surveys, like what lessons can we learn from that experience? And do we need services now for those staff? / what can we learn so that we don't maybe repeat some of the really hard and challenging things, given that we all know we're working crisis management all the time, and some version of that may happen again?
I am not personally aware, but I will definitely, if we can catch up afterward, let's make sure we talk for a few moments, and we'll make sure we take your name down. And if I can find some things, or we can find some things, my colleagues will definitely chase that out. That flashback moment just played out again because of what was happening in the next room. They were having exactly the same conversation about what it takes to help facilities workers in particular, right, but people in colleges and universities in general, right, deal with the fact that they were essential, they were special. For the first time in a very long time, they were able to come up from below floor, right, and be seen. And now they're dealing with the expectation, as you're describing, of continuing to have to deliver at that rate and at that pace and at that level, and everybody else is dealing with things. And yes, everybody dealt with traumas. Every individual dealt with the trauma, right? There were challenges, there were difficulties. Some people dealt with death, right? I mean, it doesn't get much more extreme than that in terms of traumas, and yet you're asked to continue to move forward. And worst of all, sometimes that specialness, right? That thanking the Amazon delivery person that we were all doing in 2020, and thanking the person cleaning the floors and sanitizing things for us early on has gone away, and you start feeling like you're less than. And we need to make sure that we focus on it. They were particularly talking about training and development techniques, just the effort of investing time in your people, right? Getting more involved in getting people to take advantage. See the work as a step forward and not just ongoing drudgery, right? Think about the growth and development of your people as a way to motivate and change that. So you're thinking about this as not just a forever interminable thing, but something that you can move beyond and move through and build upon, right? Was the language they were using. But I will definitely, we'll follow up. Let's follow up after. We'll talk about finding any other service people are doing.
Thank you very much, Pete. Yeah.
Thank you all very much for your time.